The bar was one of those places where the lights always hung low, casting a moody glow over sleek, modern furnishings. The music pulsed steadily, just loud enough to muffle the relentless hum of the city outside. It was a well-known spot, famous for its expansive selection of drinks and an atmosphere that drew in a diverse mix of patrons. Tonight, the place buzzed with energy. Corporate professionals unwinding after work, groups of friends laughing over cocktails, and solitary drinkers lost in their own thoughts. Jaden stepped through the heavy wooden door, leaving behind the crisp autumn air. The warmth inside wrapped around him instantly, a stark contrast to the chill outside. He was dressed sharply, a tailored suit hugging his frame, polished shoes catching the dim light. His presence naturally commanded attention, not just because of his refined appearance, but because of the quiet confidence that clung to him. As he moved deeper into the bar, he felt a few glances in his direction. Curious, fleeting, indifferent. He was used to it. His eyes swept over the long row of backlit liquor bottles before he took a seat at the bar. With practiced ease, he placed his phone and wallet on the polished surface, his fingers tapping idly as he caught the bartender's eye. Tom, a man who looked comfortable in the role of entertaining guests, was busy with a small group at the far end. Jaden gave a polite nod, an unspoken signal that he was ready to order. But Tom didn't acknowledge him. Jaden dismissed it at first. It was a busy night after all. He had no problem waiting. He leaned back, observing the crowd, taking in the easy laughter and clinking of glasses. It was a familiar scene, one he had settled into countless times before. Minutes passed. Jaden's patience began to wear thin as he watched Tom effortlessly tend to other customers. A man, white and casually dressed, approached the bar. Without hesitation, Tom greeted him with an easy smile, already reaching for a bottle before the man even spoke his order. Jaden straightened slightly, lifting a hand. "Excuse me?" he called out, his voice calm but firm. Tom glanced in his direction, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. But then, as if Jaden was nothing more than a shadow in the periphery, Tom turned away. He moved down the bar, laughing at something a pair of newly arrived women had said, his focus entirely on them. Jaden's jaw tightened. His fingers drummed against the wooden surface, slow and deliberate. It was becoming obvious now. This wasn't just inattentiveness. This was something more. He had experienced moments like this before, the kind of slights that were subtle enough for others to overlook, but sharp enough to cut. A delay here, an avoidance there, an invisible wall that only some had the privilege of not seeing. More minutes passed, stretching unbearably long. Around him, drinks flowed easily, orders taken and filled without hesitation. The bartender's face was open and friendly to everyone else, his laughter rich, his demeanor inviting. But when his gaze swept past Jaden, it was as if he wasn't even there. A few nearby patrons had noticed. Some looked away, unwilling to get involved. Others exchanged glances, small, knowing looks that carried quiet disapproval, but nothing more. No one spoke up. Jaden inhaled deeply, steadying himself against the simmering frustration building inside him. Again he cleared his throat, this time louder, more forceful. "Excuse me," he repeated, his voice edged with a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. This time Tom turned, his face a mask of feigned surprise. "Oh, sorry, didn't see you there," he said, the words empty of any real apology. Jaden held his gaze steady, unreadable. "I've been waiting a while," he replied, his tone even but firm. "Bourbon. Neat." Tom nodded, but something flickered in his expression. Something sour, something dismissive. He turned to retrieve a glass, and in that brief moment, Jaden caught the slightest roll of his eyes. Small, almost imperceptible. But it spoke volumes. Jaden's chest tightened, anger curling in his gut. He had seen that look before, had felt the weight of that unspoken message too many times. "You don't belong here." As the bartender poured his drink, Jaden sat still, his hands steady, his face unreadable. But inside, the sting of it all burned deep. The evening had started like any other. Jaden had walked into the bar expecting nothing more than a drink, a moment to unwind after a long day. And the same courtesy extended to every other patron. But from the instant he had taken his seat, something had felt off. The weight of a too familiar experience settled over him like an unwelcome shadow. He had been treated as less than, an unspoken dismissal that gnawed at the edges of his dignity, a subtle yet undeniable reminder of the countless times he had been made to feel invisible simply because of the color of his skin. When Tom finally placed the drink in front of him, the glass hit the counter with a sharp clink. Louder than necessary, a sound that carried more than just the impact of glass against wood. It was deliberate, cold. Jaden's eyes rested on the bourbon for a long moment before his fingers curled around the cool glass. He brought it to his lips, the rich burn of alcohol spreading through him, but it did nothing to quiet the slow-burning anger simmering just beneath the surface. Tom had already moved on, now serving another customer with the kind of warmth and ease that had been so noticeably absent in his interactions with Jaden. He watched as the bartender grinned, his demeanor open and inviting, an effortless charm reserved for everyone else. A bitter taste settled in Jaden's mouth, one that had nothing to do with the drink. He had come here for a simple, quiet evening, a chance to unwind. Instead, he had been dragged into yet another exhausting and demoralizing moment, one that played out too often, in too many places. The realization sat heavy on his chest. Laughter rang out from a group at the far end of the bar, drawing his gaze. 3 women, all white, lifted their glasses in a cheerful toast, their joy unburdened and uninterrupted. Tom stood nearby, smiling easily, engaged in effortless conversation, his attention solely on them. And Jaden knew. The contrast was glaring. He could see it, feel it in the tightness of his jaw, in the way his grip on the glass subtly tensed. A part of him wanted to walk out, to leave and never return, to remove himself from a space that had made it clear he was unwelcome. It would have been easier, cleaner, a quiet retreat from yet another battle that felt all too familiar. But another part of him, the part that refused to shrink in the face of prejudice, told him to stay. He had every right to be here, just as much as anyone else. And he wasn't going to let a man like Tom dictate where he did or didn't belong. The night was supposed to be simple. Now he found himself at a crossroads. He could let it slide, pretend it hadn't happened, swallow the bitterness like he had so many times before, or he could confront it, stand his ground, refuse to be dismissed so easily. Jaden took another slow sip of bourbon, his decision made. He wasn't letting this go, not this time. His anger was controlled, sharp, honed into something more powerful than just emotion. He wasn't going to make a scene, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew how quickly things could spiral. He had seen it before, the way confrontation could be turned against him, how a rightful demand for respect could be twisted into an overreaction. But he also knew he couldn't stay silent. He watched Tom move through the bar, watched the ease with which he attended to others, his deliberate avoidance of Jaden standing out like a glaring stain against the backdrop of smooth hospitality. The more Jaden observed, the more resolute he became. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small, overlooked, unworthy of the same respect so freely given to others. Minutes later, Tom circled back to Jaden's end of the bar, wiping down the counter as he passed. Jaden didn't hesitate. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "Tom, right?" The bartender looked up, surprise flashing across his face before his expression settled into something more indifferent. "Yeah, what can I do for you?" Jaden held his gaze unwavering. "I couldn't help but notice that it took quite a while for you to serve me." His words were measured, but there was no mistaking the edge in his voice. "I've been sitting here for some time, and I watched you serve multiple people who arrived after me." Tom's face remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, an irritation, a slight tightening of his jaw. "It's a busy night," he said, his tone clipped. "I'm doing the best I can." Jaden nodded slowly. He let the words settle before responding. "I understand that," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But it feels like you were avoiding me on purpose, and I'd like to know why." Tom's eyes narrowed, a defensive edge creeping into his posture. "You're imagining things," he muttered, his voice tinged with annoyance. "I treat all my customers the same." Jaden didn't flinch. He had expected this. Denial, dismissal, the same tired deflections. But he wasn't backing down. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, his voice unwavering. "Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look that way. And I'm pretty sure others noticed it too." At that, Tom's expression hardened. He straightened up, tossing the rag he had been using into the sink with a little too much force. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to imply, but I don't have time for this." His voice was sharp now, irritation barely contained. "If you've got a problem, maybe this isn't the place for you." Jaden felt something inside him go ice cold. There it was. The unspoken truth laid bare. The underlying message wrapped in feigned professionalism, but poisoned all the same. "You don't belong here." Jaden exhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady. "You're right," he said, his tone controlled but edged with steel. "I do have a problem. My problem is that I came here expecting to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. And instead, I've been made to feel like I don't belong. And that's not okay." Tom scoffed, unimpressed. "Look, man, I'm just doing my job. If you don't like the service, you can take your business somewhere else." Jaden tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Is that how you handle complaints? By telling people to leave when they call out something that's wrong?" His voice was calm, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. "Because I have to say, that's not a very professional attitude." Tom stepped closer, his posture subtly shifting, his voice lowering into something more hostile. "You think you can just come in here and tell me how to do my job?" he snapped. "I've been working here for years. I know how to handle people like you." Jaden felt the words like a slap. "People like you." There it was again. The mask slipping, the truth showing itself in the ugliest way possible. Jaden set his glass down, his fingers steady against the wood. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't overreacting. And he wasn't letting it slide. Not this time. Before he spoke again, he met Tom's gaze, making sure the bartender saw exactly what he was dealing with. A man who wasn't afraid. A man who wouldn't be pushed aside. A man who refused to be made small. The night wasn't over, and neither was this. The door to the bar swung open with a quiet creak, and a man in his late 50s stepped inside. He was impeccably dressed, exuding an air of quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. Conversations hushed, laughter tapered off, and a subtle shift in energy rippled through the room as people took notice of his arrival. This was Samuel, the owner of the bar, a respected figure in the community, a man whose presence carried weight. His sharp eyes swept across the room, instantly locking onto the tense exchange between Jaden and Tom. His expression darkened, his features tightening as he absorbed the scene before him. Without hesitation, he strode forward, his steps measured and deliberate, cutting through the uneasy silence like a blade. "Tom." Samuel's voice was calm but carried an undeniable edge of authority. "What's going on here?" Tom's confident facade wavered as he turned to face his employer. His bravado, so evident just moments ago, faltered under the weight of Samuel's gaze. "Nothing, Mr. Samuel," he said quickly, his voice thin and unsteady. "Just a little misunderstanding with a customer." Samuel's eyes shifted to Jaden, assessing him with an unreadable expression. There was a flicker of recognition there, though he remained composed. "Is that so?" he asked, though the skepticism in his tone made it clear he wasn't buying Tom's hasty excuse. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Jaden held Samuel's gaze, choosing his words carefully. He had seen Samuel's face in business magazines, read about him in articles that spoke of his sharp mind and unwavering principles. He knew the man to be fair, respected, and deeply invested in the values he built his business on. But what Tom and everyone else in the bar didn't know was the truth that would change everything. Jaden inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "It seems there's been some confusion about how customers should be treated here," he said, his voice even but firm. "I've been waiting for service for quite some time, but Tom seemed to have other priorities." Samuel's expression darkened further. His gaze snapped back to Tom, pinning him in place. "Is that true?" Tom swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't mean anything by it, Mr. Samuel," he stammered. "It's just been a busy night, that's all." Samuel's stare didn't waver. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of finality. "Busy or not, that's no excuse. Every customer who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with the same respect. No exceptions. The entire bar had fallen into complete silence now, every set of eyes fixed on the unfolding confrontation. The weight of Samuel's words pressed down on the room, thick and undeniable. Tom's confidence had crumbled. He fidgeted, his earlier arrogance replaced with visible unease. But Jaden knew that this moment wasn't just about Tom. It was about something much larger, something heavier. It was about the reality he faced time and time again. No matter how successful he became, no matter how he dressed, no matter how polite he was, there would always be people who saw him as less than, people who assumed he did not belong. Samuel took a step closer to Tom, lowering his voice to a measured, deliberate tone. This isn't just about one bad interaction, Tom. It's about the choices you make when you think no one is watching. It's about how you treat people, not just when it's easy, but when it matters. Tom's eyes darted around the bar, desperate for an escape, but there was none. Mr. Samuel, I swear, I didn't. Samuel cut him off with a sharp look. Enough. His voice, though calm, was edged with steel. Your job is to make every customer feel welcome, and tonight you failed. He exhaled, shaking his head. But there's something you should have known before you decided to treat this man differently. Samuel turned to Jaden then, his gaze softening, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. Jaden met his father's eyes, understanding passing between them in a way that needed no words. Then Samuel spoke, his voice carrying through the silent bar like a rolling storm. This is my son. The revelation struck the room like a thunderclap. A wave of stunned murmurs rippled through the crowd as the realization sank in. Tom's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a man struggling for breath. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him, leaving him floundering in the aftermath. He had disrespected not just any customer, but the son of the man who owned the very establishment in which he stood. Jaden felt the emotions swirl within him. Vindication, sadness, exhaustion. He hadn't wanted it to come to this. He hadn't wanted to pull rank, to be seen for his connection rather than his own worth. But that was the world he lived in. Too often, respect was something he had to prove he deserved, rather than something freely given. He glanced around the bar, taking in the faces watching them. The quiet discomfort, the knowing glances, the subtle shifts in posture as people recalibrated their perceptions. And in that moment, Jaden understood something deeper than just this confrontation. Tonight wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel small. And tonight, for once, the truth had been laid bare for everyone to see. The door to the bar swung open, and a man in his late 50s strode in with an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. Conversation softened, glasses paused midair, and a hush rippled through the room as recognition dawned on the patrons. This was Samuel, the owner of the bar, a man deeply respected in the community. His sharp eyes scanned the room, quickly landing on the tense standoff between Jaden and Tom. His expression darkened as he took in the scene, his posture stiffening with restrained control. Samuel moved toward the bar with deliberate steps, his presence alone demanding silence. Tom, he called out, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. What's going on here? Tom's earlier bravado withered under his employer's gaze. He turned, fumbling for words. Nothing, Mr. Samuel. Just a misunderstanding. Samuel's gaze flickered toward Jaden, assessing his son with a knowing look. Unlike the others in the room, he understood the depth of what had transpired before even a word was spoken. The weight of history, of countless unseen battles, lay between them. His voice, when he spoke again, was razor sharp. A misunderstanding, you say? Jaden met his father's eyes, his expression composed, but his jaw set with quiet resolve. He had seen Samuel's name in business articles, heard stories of the man's fairness. But here, in this moment, none of that mattered. Here he was simply a man who had been made to feel small. There seems to be confusion about how customers are treated here, Jaden said evenly, his voice measured but firm. I sat here for a long time while Tom served others who arrived after me. It was clear I was not welcome in the same way. Samuel turned back to Tom, his expression unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Tom's face had drained of color. I, it wasn't intentional, he stammered. I was just busy. I didn't mean anything by it. Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. Busy or not, there is no excuse for treating a customer as less than. This is my establishment, and I will not tolerate discrimination of any kind. The words settled heavily over the room, their impact rippling through the gathered patrons. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware of the silent ways they had condoned such behavior. Others lowered their eyes, embarrassed by the clarity of the moment. Jaden took a deep breath, knowing he had an opportunity to speak for more than just himself. This isn't just about me, he said, his voice unwavering. It's about how we choose to treat one another. Every time we let prejudice slide, every time we stay silent, we give it power. It makes people feel invisible, like they don't belong. That should never happen. Not here, not anywhere. His words carried a quiet strength that made people pause. A few nodded in agreement, others sat in thoughtful silence, the weight of his statement sinking in. Samuel's gaze never wavered from Tom. Jaden is right, he said, his voice low but commanding. We all have a role to play in ensuring this kind of behavior doesn't happen again. And as the owner, it's my responsibility to make sure that everyone who works here understands that. He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders shifting from anger to resolution. Tom, I need you to leave for the night. We'll discuss your future here tomorrow. Tom's mouth opened as if to argue, but the finality in Samuel's voice left no room for negotiation. He nodded stiffly, his face pale, shame clinging to his every movement as he turned and walked toward the door. The room remained silent as the door clicked shut behind him. Samuel turned to Jaden then, his expression softening. He placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, his voice quieter now. I'm sorry you had to go through that, he said, regret laced through his words. But I'm proud of how you handled it. Jaden nodded, his emotions a complex mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. Thanks, Dad, he said, his voice softer now. I just hope people learn from this. Samuel offered a small, knowing smile. They will, he assured, because I won't let this place be anything less than what it's supposed to be. The atmosphere in the bar slowly shifted, the tension fading but leaving behind a new awareness, a reminder that change starts in small, deliberate moments. Jaden took his seat again, his glass nearly empty. He had won this battle, but he knew there would be others. Still, as he took another slow sip of his drink, he allowed himself a moment of quiet victory. Tonight, he had made a difference. Samuel sighed, his expression heavy with the weight of the night's events. I'll have a serious conversation with him tomorrow, he said, his voice steady but laced with finality. But no matter what happens, he needs to understand that this can never happen again. Jaden let his gaze sweep across the room, noticing a shift in the atmosphere. Conversations were slowly resuming, laughter cautiously creeping back into the air. But something was different now. There was a newfound awareness in the way people looked at one another, more recognition, more understanding, as if the confrontation had forced them to confront something within themselves. As if to confirm his thoughts, a couple hesitantly approached. The man, likely in his early 30s, cleared his throat before speaking. Hey, I just wanted to say, that was really something back there. I'm sorry you had to go through that. His companion, a woman with warm, empathetic eyes, nodded. Yeah, we've been coming here for years and we've never seen anything like that before. It wasn't right. I'm glad you spoke up. Jaden gave them a small, appreciative smile. Thank you. It means a lot to hear that. The truth is, this kind of thing happens more often than people realize. But it doesn't have to. We all have the power to do better. Samuel extended his hand, shaking theirs firmly. I appreciate that. We're going to make sure this place is what it's supposed to be, a home for everyone who walks through those doors. Your support means a lot. As the couple returned to their table, Jaden felt something stirring in the room. This wasn't just about Tom anymore. It was about something bigger, something deeper, a collective realization that change wasn't just necessary, but possible. Jaden sighed, setting his empty glass on the counter. I think I'm going to head out, Dad. It's been a long night. Samuel's expression softened as he looked at his son, pride and love evident in his eyes. I understand, but Jaden, thank you. You handled that with a lot of grace. I'm proud of you. Jaden felt warmth spread through his chest, a deep, quiet affirmation that he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Thanks, Dad. I'm proud of you too. I know you'll make sure this place becomes everything it's meant to be. They shared a brief but meaningful embrace, a silent exchange of love, respect, and mutual understanding. Then, with one last glance at his father, Jaden grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The night air was crisp as he stepped outside, filling his lungs with the coolness of it. He paused for a moment, looking back at the bar, its golden glow spilling onto the pavement. This place, his father's dream, now his legacy, had been shaken tonight. But perhaps that wasn't a bad thing. Sometimes the foundation had to be tested to make sure it could hold the weight of something greater. With a deep breath, he turned and started walking. The city hummed softly around him, but for once he felt apart from its constant movement, as if the universe itself had given him a moment to process everything. Tonight had been a battle not just for respect, but for something deeper: dignity, recognition, belonging. And though he had won this round, he knew the fight was far from over. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a message from his father. Thank you again, son. We'll make sure this never happens again. Love you. Jaden's lips curved into a small smile. He typed a quick reply before slipping the phone back into his pocket. The night stretched ahead of him, quiet and reflective, his footsteps steady as he made his way toward the small park he often visited when he needed to clear his mind. When he arrived, he settled beneath a towering oak tree, leaning against its rough bark. The park was nearly empty, just a few stragglers lost in their own worlds. Jaden let his eyes close for a moment, letting the events of the evening replay in his mind. A flicker of anger still burned beneath his ribs, not just at Tom, but at a world that allowed these moments to keep happening. No matter how successful he became, no matter how well he carried himself, there would always be someone who saw him as less. That truth sat heavy in his chest, but alongside the anger was something else: pride, not in the confrontation itself, but in how he had handled it, in the way his father had supported him, in the way people had listened. He had made a difference tonight, even if only in this one small corner of the world. Jaden exhaled slowly, tilting his head up toward the sky. The stars flickered above, distant but unwavering, a reminder that even in darkness there was light. Even in struggle there was hope. And so, with his resolve stronger than ever, Jaden sat beneath the old oak tree, allowing himself a moment of stillness before he stood and walked forward, toward whatever came next. Jaden lifted his gaze to the night sky, where the stars, though faint against the city's glow, still held their quiet vigil. Their presence, distant yet unwavering, reminded him of the vastness of existence, the endless stories unfolding beyond his own. He felt small beneath their watchful light, yet not insignificant, because tonight had mattered. His thoughts drifted to the bar, to his father, to the weight of what had happened and the deeper truths it revealed. Prejudice was a shadow he had learned to live with, one that stretched long across his life, following him in ways both subtle and blatant. He knew tonight wouldn't be the last time he was forced to confront it, but he also knew something else. He had the strength to do so. Tonight had proved that. He thought of the faces in the bar, the unspoken apologies in their eyes, the quiet shift in awareness that had settled over the room like an unseen tide. Change wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came in the form of a conversation, a reckoning, a moment where someone realized they had been blind and vowed to see differently. Jaden exhaled, a slow release of the tension that had gripped him all night. As he sat beneath the oak tree, feeling the rough bark press against his back, he made a silent vow. He would keep fighting, not just for himself, but for those whose voices went unheard, for those too weary or too afraid to stand up. He would use every bit of influence, every ounce of strength, to carve out space for justice, for dignity, for belonging. After a while, he rose to his feet, a quiet resolve settling deep within him. He left the park, his steps steady as he walked through the hushed streets. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of a city that never truly slept. He knew the road ahead would be long, that there would be more battles to face, more moments like tonight. But he wasn't afraid. He had his father's support. He had his own unshakable convictions. And he had the certainty that no matter how difficult the journey became, he would keep moving forward. Because the fight for respect, for justice, for a world where no one had to prove their worth just to be seen, it wasn't just his battle, it was his purpose.